We will have today Dr. Alice Horton presenting an amazing presentation. She's an anthropogenic contaminant scientist with an expertise in microplastic pollution. Her research focuses especially on microplastic within the aquatic environment. And she's keen to understand how the connections between land, lake, rivers, and the sea lead to the transport and accumulation of microplastic within the environment. She also carries out research to better understand how ecological interactions may alter the fate and behavior of microplastic. Alice, the floor is now yours.
So thank you to Audrey for introducing me, and to Ocean Plastic Webinars for hosting me today, and also to you for joining me online. My name is Dr. Alice Horton. I work at the National Oceanography Centre in the UK, and my research focuses on microplastics. And I want to tell you a bit today about my research, especially looking at microplastics from source to the National Oceanography Centre is where I'm based. This is in Southampton, in the south of the UK. I work in this long building here. We also have a site up in Liverpool, which is in the north of England. And NOC, National Oceanography Centre, is home to two significant research vessels. We have the RRS Discovery and the RRS James Cook. And we're also home to the infamous Auto Sub, among many others, Boaty Boatface, which you might have heard of. So my research focuses broadly on anthropogenic contaminants, and this really means human-derived pollution within the environment. But I have a specific focus and a specific expertise on microplastics. So I sit within the Microplastics Research Group at NOC, and this is part of the Ocean Biogeochemistry and Ecosystems Group. And I'm really interested to try and understand how microplastics get from where they start to where they end up within the environment. And this includes looking at the sources of microplastics, how they're transported down rivers, out into the coasts and open ocean areas, and ultimately down to the deep sea. This also involves trying to understand how and why microplastics are transported, where they accumulate, and what influences the behaviour of these particles, because we know they're made up of all different types of materials, they're different shapes and sizes, so they can all behave in different ways. I also want to try and understand the ecological effects and the implications of microplastics as a pollutant within the environment. So do organisms interact with these particles? If they do, are they hazardous? Do they cause harm? And does this mean anything long-term for organisms individually and for ecosystems as a whole? So you're all probably aware of microplastics. I mean, you've joined this webinar for a reason. You must have been interested in microplastics, and you've probably seen a lot of news stories popping up. So, for example, microplastics in seafood, microplastics in bottled water that we're drinking, very high concentrations of microplastics found in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. Microplastics found at the deepest point of the ocean, so in the Mariana Trench, plastic bags, for example. And most recently, a study found that more than 1,000 tons of microplastics are raining down on US national parks per year. So that's microplastics that are in the air that are being deposited onto the land. And all of these are based on studies that are continually developing within this field of microplastic research. So what are they? I think it's quite important at this point to define what a microplastic is, because again, you will have heard this term a lot, but it's often not very well defined within these news stories that you might read. So the definition of a microplastic is that it's a solid polymer particle or plastic particle. It's less than 5 millimeters in size. So actually this doesn't necessarily mean that a particle is microscopic. You can see the largest ones with your naked eye, but the range does span a very broad size range. So the smallest ones are in the micron range, so you wouldn't see these, they are very microscopic. These are insoluble in water, and they're very resistant to biodegradation. So a point to make here is that plastics are not necessarily completely resistant to biodegradation. You might have heard stories of plastics being degraded, for example, by bacteria and fungi, and this can happen. But actually within the environment, this is uncommon. I mean, the conditions that are required for this biodegradation will not be found everywhere. So this is not a solution to plastic pollution. There are lots of sources of microplastics, and they're very diverse. So when we're talking about microplastics, we generally refer to two kind of categories. Firstly, we have primary microplastics, and these are the ones that are specifically designed to be of a very small size. So we've got things like microbeads here found in body scrubs. These have been banned now in many countries around the world, but they can still be found in some products in various places. Things like glitter that you would find in cosmetics. This is still widely used. This hasn't been banned. And then we have things like nurdles or pre-production pellets. And these are pellets that you often find washed up on beaches. They're used as the raw feedstock for manufacture of plastic products. So these would be melted down and reformed into various shapes like plastic bottles, for example. But also when we're thinking about microplastics, we have secondary microplastics. And these are the ones that are much more commonly found within the environment. And they're derived from larger items. So they break or they shed from larger items while they're in use. So one that you might have heard of is this in the middle, microfibers. If you have synthetic fabrics like nylon and polyester, these can shed fibers either while they're being worn or when you put them in the laundry that release into the environment. We also have things like plastic films or plastic bags that might break down into fragments and pieces when they get old, either when they're in the environment or you might have it in the back of a cupboard in your house and it starts to break apart. Things like materials that might be used for construction. We know that plastics are used for a lot of construction materials and wider uses, of course, globally. So while these materials are being used, manufacture is taking place, dust and particles can be shed from these. So there are lots of ways in which microplastics can be released and can enter the environment. So really in this story of land sources to sea, we have to start at the land. I mean, this is where plastics are manufactured. It's where the majority of plastics are used. It's where we reside, humans, and it's where the most of the plastics are discarded as well. But despite this, there have actually been quite very few studies quantifying microplastics on land, especially microplastics within soils, even though we believe that microplastics are likely to be quite abundant in soils. We know, for example, that litter breaks down, as I just mentioned, and we often see sites like this image on the right dumping on land, where if these plastics are not collected, they will just ultimately degrade into the soils. We also know that microfibers and other particles might enter the terrestrial environment in sewage sludge. So this sewage sludge is often applied to land as a fertilizer or as a soil conditioner and can contain particles that are applied directly to the land. And in this instance, microplastics might either accumulate within the soils, or if there's very heavy rainfall, for example, they might be washed from the soils and enter waterways via runoff. So, for example, drainage into river systems. So, in a lot of ways, microplastics can enter soil and rivers. Now, this diagram was part of a report that was published by the IUCN a few years ago, giving an estimate of the releases of microplastics to the oceans. And their calculations suggested that actually around 98% of microplastics are derived from land. So this goes back to what I was saying about this is where plastics are used, manufactured and disposed of. So this is not really surprising. What it also shows on the far right-hand side is that actually not all these plastics will end up reaching the ocean. In fact, around 52% are likely to be retained on land within soils. The other half will probably reach the ocean. So it's not necessarily the case that we're just talking about plastics in the ocean all the time. And there, of course, are different sources here. So we have road runoff as a potentially large source, wastewater at around 25%. So again, there are lots of things that we need to consider here. So moving from the land to the rivers, there are quite a lot of ways in which microplastics and other pollutants can enter rivers. So this is focused on what I know of inputs to rivers in the UK, but this will be widely applicable globally. So we have things like storm drain input, and this is where you've got road drainage systems that instead of going to sewage systems, they're directly directed into river systems. So this is untreated street or road runoff that gets put into rivers. We have sewage effluent input. So treated sewage often gets input and discharged straight into river systems. We also have combined sewage overflows, or CSOs, which you might have heard of as they've been in the news occasionally. These discharge raw sewage to rivers, and this does not happen all that often. This is designed for extreme weather events. So, for example, if you've got very high rainfall and flooding, the sewage systems can't handle the amount of flow that's going down them. They're designed to discharge so that sewage doesn't end up backing up into people's homes, for example. We've also got things I mentioned like land runoff, drainage ditches, especially in agricultural areas. And then we could just have, for example, litter that's input or dumped straight into river systems. So when I started doing microplastic research, it was around 6 years ago, and not very much had been done on microplastics within rivers at all, and nothing had been done on rivers within the UK, which is where I'm based. So this seemed like an obvious place to start. So the question really was, are microplastics to be found within rivers in the UK? And how does this relate to the site at which they might be found? So I chose 4 sites that I believed would be contaminated to different degrees. And the reason that I chose these was based on the amount of sewage effluent that I knew to be input to these sites. So as you go from left to right on this graph, you have an increasing amount of sewage within that system. So you would expect, or I expected, the site on the far right to be much more contaminated than the site on the far left. In fact, what I found was not that at all, and actually this was really interesting. So the site that I expected to be the most contaminated wasn't, it was the second most, and this one in the middle was actually far more contaminated than the other sites. And this was really interesting, and it took quite a bit of investigation for me to try and understand why this was. But ultimately it became clear because this site was directly downstream of that storm drain that I mentioned earlier. So this receives the untreated road runoff from an upstream town. And in this site, I was finding a lot of particles that were derived from this road, from the town and from the road surface. And if you look at this diagram, it actually becomes really clear how particles from road surfaces can enter these river systems. So on the left here, we have a red coated road surface. And this is often a thermoplastic road marking paint. So they apply this as a hot liquid paint, which solidifies as it cools. But of course, we know that road paints don't last forever. They have to be replaced quite often. And what happens is that particles of this paint and of the surface of the road degrade. They wash straight down the drain. So here you can see quite a number of these red particles washing straight down the drain system. This is transported directly out from this storm drain and released into the river. And these on the right are examples of particles I found within the river sediment. So it becomes a really clear link from land to the river, from the road to the river sediment here. Another thing that I mentioned is laundry, and a bit of research has gone into this. So I mentioned synthetic fabrics. A very common example of this would be a fleece jacket, for example. This would be made of polyester. You put this into your washing machine and then it releases lots of fibres as the washing machine does its job. And there was a study carried out by Imogen Napper and Richard Thompson in 2016. They actually found that a 6 kilogram load of laundry could release over 700,000 microplastic fibres. And this especially was looking at acrylic, which is a synthetic material. If you look at polyester, this released around 500,000, polyester cotton a bit lower. So this is really interesting, A, because it's showing how many particles can be released, but B, because it's actually showing that different types of material might release different amounts of fibres. And this might relate to the material, but it might also relate to the way in which the garment is manufactured, for example. So to do with the weave, maybe, of the fabric. So there are lots of considerations with things that we need to look at when it's different types of fabric, for example. So when we want to try and understand the ways in which microplastics are transported within the environment, it gets quite complex. So this diagram, I understand, is quite complex, and this really is a representation, and this is quite a simplistic representation of the way in which things might move around. What this really shows is that it's not necessarily the case that microplastics will enter from the land into rivers and out into the oceans, although that's what's often stated, and in fact that will happen in a lot of cases. However, we also know that a very large proportion of these plastics will either be retained on land or in river systems. So these orange boxes represent accumulation zones. So we've got, for example, lake sediments, soils, river sediments, and so on. So these are places that microplastics might be retained. But we also have these sort of feedback loops. So, for example, plastics that enter the ocean might not necessarily remain there. They might be redeposited back onto land, for example, plastics onto beaches during high tides or during storm events. Plastics that are within river water might be released back onto soils during flooding, for example. So it's not necessarily a linear process. And this is something that we're really trying to understand. Something that people are looking at a lot now is microplastics in air. And this again becomes a lot more complex because the way in which the air moves around can influence where the microplastics are deposited. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of plastics are input directly to the oceans. This figure states that 20% of marine plastics are released directly at sea. And in fact, I'm aware that there was a diagram earlier from the IUCN that suggested that this was 2%. So this really highlights the variability in the calculations that people undertake. But this is also taking into account large plastics. And this accounts for things like fishing gear that might be dumped or accidentally lost at sea, flakes of boat paint, dumping of waste, either intentionally or unintentionally, litter, and also nurdles I mentioned earlier. These pre-production pellets are often transported around in shipping containers. And we know that ships can lose their cargo en route, and often these pellets are one of the casualties of that loss. And there's really this kind of conundrum of plastics in the ocean, because we're able to make calculations on the amount that we believe is input to the ocean based on mismanaged waste, for example, the amount of plastic that's manufactured and utilized every year, and the amount that's mismanaged and is likely to end up within the ocean. And this is a huge figure. This is an average estimate of around 8 million tons per year of plastic will make its way into the ocean. So this is really considerable. However, when we start looking for this plastic in the ocean, this becomes a bit more difficult, because actually, if we're looking for large pieces of plastic, we can only account for around 10% of the amount of plastic that we believe should be in the ocean. If we start looking then at the smaller pieces of plastic, less than 200 millimeters, and including these microplastics, we can then only account for around 1% of what we believe should be in the ocean. So this really begs the question then, where is this lost 99%? We know that it's being input to the ocean, or we've calculated that it's being input to the ocean, yet we're not able to find it. Where's it gone? So this is a question that a couple of colleagues of mine, Richard Lampit and Katya Paboltsava, have been carrying out for the last few years. And they've been sampling in the Atlantic Ocean to try and delve down into this question. So what they did is they carried out a transect in the Atlantic from north to south, which you can see here on the left. And rather than just taking samples at the surface layer of the ocean here, they actually also took samples at different depths relating to the mixed layer depth of the ocean, trying to find out if the concentration of these plastics would change with depth. Are we seeing more plastics floating at the surface? Because this might be what you would expect. We know that plastics generally float, but we also know that in the ocean, they can become fouled, they can have organisms growing on their surface. Different processes can change the density of these plastics and then potentially their behavior. And their results showed that, in fact, this is the case. We're not necessarily seeing that the highest concentrations of these plastics are found at the surface of the ocean. In fact, looking at this graph, you can see that it's really, really variable. Depending on the site that you're looking at, you find vastly different results. So this is done by mass, but at some sites you find a greater mass at the surface compared to a depth. Other sites you see the opposite trend. So this is really transformative for our understanding of plastics, because it means that we can't just make assumptions based on where we expect plastic to be. We really need to try and understand these more complex interactions and processes that influence where the plastics will go and whether they will sink or float. The work of my colleagues, however, went quite a lot smaller. They went down to 36 microns. And you wouldn't necessarily expect this difference in size of around 260 microns to really make a difference. But potentially it has. Maybe this is why we're seeing such a big difference. So the overriding kind of messages that we can take from this study is that not all microplastics are floating. We can't expect to be able to quantify what's in the ocean by just looking at what's on the surface. Many of them are at depths that we might not expect. And also that the mass of microplastics in the ocean is actually greater than what we might expect. So we need to try and be able to understand why this is. And I mentioned size, and this is a really important consideration for all of us who are working on the issue of microplastics in the environment. So if you think about this estimate here on the left, we're looking here at 300 microns in size. We look at this graph now, this is right up here at the far right-hand end. And proportionally, we're seeing very few of these particles in the environment. However, as you go smaller and smaller, you get exponentially more particles of these microplastics within the environment. And if you think about the study carried out by my colleagues, we're looking down at this far left-hand end here, around 30 to 40 microns, where we're seeing vastly more microplastics by number than you would do at this far right-hand end. So this could be an explanation as to why we're finding more than we would expect, because we're looking for more, we're looking harder. And this is really important for future studies, because are we making estimates based on things that are not necessarily, factually correct? Do we need to look smaller and smaller to try and really understand this mass? And this size distribution really makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because we know, although plastic doesn't go away, we know that it breaks. You have an item of plastic in your house and it will break quite quickly. And this is also the case for plastics within the environment, especially if they're exposed to high temperatures in the form of sunlight, UV radiation, different forces that will break them down. Items can break into smaller and smaller pieces. So one plastic bottle, for example, could end up as 1,000 or hundreds of thousands of smaller pieces. The mass of the plastic hasn't necessarily changed, but now it's many, many more small pieces. So this is something that's really important, especially if we know about all the plastic that's in the environment at the moment, and the fact that we're not going to be able to remove everything, even if we try to do cleanups, for example. We're not going to be able to remove everything in the environment. So what's already there is likely to continue to break down into smaller and smaller pieces over time. And this is a photo that I took on a beach, and this kind of demonstrates this point as well. You see a few large pieces here, this green one, this orange one, but the closer you look, the more particles you see. So here in the middle, you can see these nurdles, but you can also see lots of tiny fragments of plastics. And this is really representative of what we would see in the environment with this breakdown of large items. So this leads me on kind of to a second part of my presentation, which is really what's the problem with plastic pollution. We know it's everywhere. It doesn't necessarily look very nice, but does it matter? Are there implications? Are there health implications? Are there ecosystem problems with this? So we know with large plastics, for example, that organisms can get trapped or entangled. You see this in news stories, for example, with seals with fishing wire around their neck. We know that plastics last for decades or hundreds of thousands of years even, so they're not going to go away anytime soon. And what is within the environment is accumulating because we continue to put plastic into it. Plastics, as I've mentioned, they break down into microplastics over time. Plastics also contain a lot of chemicals, and this depends on the polymer and the item that you're looking at. But as the plastic ages, these chemicals can be released into the environment, and we don't necessarily understand the problems associated with all these different chemicals, and especially the mixtures of the chemicals that are likely to be present. We know that organisms accidentally eat plastic. Again, you see news stories of whales with their guts full of plastic bags, for example, and this is also the case with microplastics. This can lead to trophic transfer, especially if we have microplastic ingestion at the base of the food chain by zooplankton or by middle levels like fish, for example. And we know that harmful effects can occur. So studies have found, for example, that microplastic ingestion can lead to reduced reproduction, or it can change the growth of the organism, or it can lead to changes in populations. However, it's important to note that this doesn't always happen. Often a lot of the studies that have been carried out show that nothing really happens at all, and that plastics can be ingested and egested without effect. So what we really need to try and understand is what does this mean for what's in the environment? The concentrations that we currently have versus the concentrations that are likely to occur within the future with this continued breakdown of particles. And this long-term exposure, a lot of what's done in the laboratory is over days or weeks, for example, whereas what's in the environment is, a constant exposure of ecosystems to plastics. So what's the difference here based on what we see in the environment, based on what we do in the laboratory? And I think it's safe to say that we know that organisms ingest microplastics. This has been shown on a number of occasions. So this was a study that I carried out myself on fish within the River Thames. So this was the common roach. And I found that 1/3 of the fish that I investigated had at least one microplastic particle within their stomach. What we can't say from this is whether that means anything for the health of the organism, but we can at least say that we know that they're ingesting them. These are images taken from a laboratory study that I carried out. This is chironomid larvae, so freshwater midge larvae, and this bright red fluorescent image is showing the ingestion of fluorescent particles by this larva. So you can see these are present throughout the whole of the body of the organism, almost throughout the gut. So yes, this highlights the ingestion, and we've seen it in many other organisms, both in the laboratory and in the field. And I mentioned hazardous effects, but what's important to note with microplastics is that they're a really diverse contaminant. It's not just, for example, beads, it's not just fibres, it's not just one type of material, it's a huge diversity of different shapes, sizes, material types, and all of these can have different effects. And it's been suggested that shape could be a really important one. And in fact, that microfibres might pose a greater hazard than microbeads. And this really could be, it's not necessarily because of the chemicals that they contain, but actually because of their physical nature. They could entangle organisms, especially if we're looking at zooplankton, which are very, very small organisms, and they, by interacting with these fibres, they can become entangled, and that can hinder their movement. Or, for example, fibres could tangle within the gut. So we can see that slightly from this image here in the bottom right. And it's been shown that fibres can form sort of balls within the gut, which might mean that they can be egested less easily, and therefore they can be retained. And this might have health implications. Another thing that I've mentioned quite a bit is particle size. And we know that particles will be moving, becoming smaller and smaller over time as they break down. And this has implications for the particle interacting with things, especially when we look at chemicals. So a smaller particle means that it has a greater surface area and therefore a greater potential for interactions with chemicals within the environment. We also know that very small particles have the potential to cross cell membranes. So when we're looking at the very smallest microparticles and nanoscale particles, rather than being ingested and remaining within the gut, they in fact might pass across the gut membranes and end up within the tissues of the organisms. And this is really difficult for us to understand very well at the moment, because these particles are so small that even with the current state-of-the-art techniques, it can be very difficult to detect these within environmental samples. So it's difficult for us to determine to what extent this is happening within the environment. But laboratory studies are starting to try and pick this apart, to try and understand this better. And what we really need to try and understand then is the potential modes of toxicity. So what is it that's causing toxicity of these particles? How are they causing toxicity within the organism? Is it chemical? Is it the physical shape of the particle? And so on. We also need to try and better understand the abundance of these microplastics, especially those of the very small scale. If these are the ones that are likely to be the most harmful and the most hazardous, potentially, then we need to try and understand how much of these are in the environment. And as I mentioned, these are the ones that are most difficult to look at because they're so small and because of the techniques that we currently have available to us. But these are things that people are currently working towards. So just to try and wrap up, really, I mean, there are a lot of questions remaining when we talk about microplastics as an environmental contaminant. And I think it can be quite easy to think, well, we must know everything. There's so much research that's being done. We found them everywhere. We know everything. But that's really not the case, as I've shown with some of this research. We're actually showing that there's maybe more out there than we previously anticipated. So trying to look at things like where do microplastics accumulate and what factors influence their fate and their behaviour and where they go. Also, what are the most significant factors influencing their toxicity? Is it their shape? Is it their size? Is it their chemical structure? Or is it something different that we haven't thought of? And how is this changed with mixtures of different types of particles? Will there be long-term ecological effects? And this is a really important one because, as I've mentioned, particles will be in the environment for a long time. We know they don't degrade very quickly, so organisms and ecosystems will be exposed over a long period of time. Are there human health consequences, and what are these, and how might they manifest themselves? And finally, how can we mitigate if this is already in the environment? Is there anything we can do about it, or do we need to stop it further up the chain? And do we need to stop these particles reaching the environment in the first place? So there are lots of questions and lots of debates that can be had around that. And maybe some of those questions will be coming up now, because I'm happy here to end my presentation and to take some questions.
All right, thank you, Alice, for your presentation. I will switch now to the Q&A slide. We have Victor asking, what does the mass distribution look like as a function of size? And there may be more small particles, but they are less massive and might be a small part of the total. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and is something that really needs to be explored, because at the moment, a lot of the studies that are being carried out on microplastics are not reporting the mass of particles. They're just reporting the number, which is fine if we want to try and understand how many there are, but it doesn't help us in understanding that mass and being able to compare it to what we believe is being put into the ocean. So I think that's a really good point. Is it the case that the smaller particles are equal in mass to the large ones? You know, my example of a plastic bottle suggests that if you have one bottle of a mass that breaks into lots of smaller particles, the mass would be the same, but that is not necessarily the case. You know, we might have mineralization, some degradation that leads to loss of mass. And yes, it could be that because they're so much smaller proportionally, we're seeing a smaller mass. But I think we can't very well understand that with the current data that we have available to us, just because of what people are reporting. So I think that we really need to try and encourage people who are reporting microplastics in their study, and it's starting to become a bit more common to report not just the number, but the mass of particles based on the polymer type and the shape of those particles, to be able to try and link these kind of understandings better.
All right, thank you. So basically, I think the question of like, what does the mass distribution look like as a function of size? You would agree that there are less bigger plastic, and then a lot more smaller because they degrade and fragment into way more number of plastic, right?
Exactly. In terms of number, we're seeing a far greater number of small particles. But how that relates to mass is difficult to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Then we have Delphine asking, which methods were used to estimate the 20% of marine plastic released at sea? And how was it different from the IUCN method?
That's an interesting question. That was not a report that I wrote, and I don't know off the top of my head what methods they used. I believe it was a consultancy that wrote that report rather than an academic scientist. So I don't know to what extent they did that research themselves. I think one of the explaining factors might be that 20% is relating to large plastics, whereas the figure that I presented earlier in the presentation, the 2%, I think it was, is relating just to microplastics. So that is suggesting that only 2% of microplastics are released directly to the oceans. However, it could be a much larger proportion of these large plastic items that are released directly in the form of the fishing gear and so on. But again, these are all really just estimates. You know, we can't very well say, well, we know that this percent or this proportion of plastic is being input to the ocean, because we don't really understand yet. You know, it's all based on model estimates and what we know of plastic manufacture versus waste and so on.
Okay, all right. So you would be saying that the answer would be between the 2% and 20+%, and
yeah, I mean, I think
to find out the real number.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think it's safe to say that it's likely that the majority of plastics that end up within the ocean originally started on land, because that's where we used it. But there will be some that are put straight to the ocean.
Of course, of course. Then we have Yushi asking, is there any possibility that Jembeck's prediction was an overestimate?
Was it what? An overestimate?
Yes.
Yes, I guess so. I mean, it's hard to say whether it's an overestimate or an underestimate, really.
Yes.
I mean, all models are estimates, and they're based on the best available information that those people had at that time. So more and different estimates have been made since then, and there's a very big range. So it helps to guide us in understanding. I mean, I think whether we say it's 8 million or 80 million or 0.8 million, it's still too much, really, if we're thinking about what's going to do.
That's what it is.
Yeah. So I think really it's just about saying, yes, we're putting a hell of a lot into the ocean.
All right. So then we have Dan asking, do you think it's possible to predict how much smaller plastic, so between 10 and 100 micrometer, is present in a particular location, based on how much of plastic above 300 micrometers is found?
I mean, again, it goes back to estimates, and I think you probably could make some estimates based on log function and an exponential curve that might tell you, this is the shape of your curve and this is what you'd be likely to see if you continue to see this trend of more and more particles as you go smaller and smaller. So yes, I think you could start to make those estimates, but I think it would be good if you could, as with any model, it would be good if you could back it up with some real data. And we're starting to be able to detect particles of those size within samples. So I think a lot of the data before now has used data that's been available because those were the techniques that were available at that time. Techniques are developing that are allowing us to look at smaller particles. So if we can use those alongside estimates, I think that will make it a lot stronger.
Yes. And definitely that curve, I would guess, but you can tell me, would be different if you're close to the sources, or if you're in the middle of the gyres, the curve will be different than if you are close to a river estuary or something like this, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the proportion of large to small particles is likely to be different in different locations. So you can't just say, right, I'm going to take an environmental sample and this will be the proportion.
All right. So someone from the OPW team is asking, primary plastic versus secondary microplastic. Primary microplastic versus secondary microplastic. Which one is the more abundant in the marine environment and why?
So it's definitely secondary microplastics. And I think the main reason for this is that we know that there's so much plastic that's out in the environment that is continuing to break down into smaller and smaller pieces. The primary microplastics, although they get released into the environment, they are generally better managed. So if we think about the microbeads in face scrubs, they're starting to be banned anyway. Microbeads in cosmetics are not being used at the same levels as we're using plastic bags, plastic bottles, tires, all these large pieces of plastic that can break down. So I think that's kind of a simple answer, is that we're just using more of the large plastics that just get discarded and break down.
For sure. All right. Someone anonymous asked, were any of the Atlantic transect samples analyzed for biofouling?
I don't believe they were, mainly because it was already quite a lot of work to do the analysis on that number of samples at that size. But that is something that would be really interesting to try and understand, is why are these particles being found at depth, and how, we can relate this to the 3 polymers that were analysed for that study. How might that change with different polymers? How might it change with the amount of biofouling on the surface? Would that change if the biofouling was removed, for example? Would that particle float back up? These are quite complex questions that I think you'd have to do a much, much bigger study to understand that.
All right. Someone else is asking, do you have any size distribution data of the water column for your transatlantic survey?
I don't have any available to me now, but there is some size distribution data available. That paper has just been accepted, actually, so that'll be available soon in the public domain.
All right.
So I can send that to you if you need to pass it on.
Okay. Christoph is asking, does a release scenario from direct input from land already exist? And could it be used for estimates of land dispersion?
Can you ask that question again? Sorry.
There's a release scenario, so like how much plastic is released from land to the ocean is available, and could we use that release scenario for estimates of ocean dispersion? So I guess if you have this as an input of an ocean hydrodynamic model.
I mean, so in terms of the volumes, there are, because this is something that I had presented, there are other models available that give slightly different outcomes when it comes to the mass of plastic being input to the oceans and the locations. So we have an idea of which rivers, for example, input potentially more plastics than others. In terms of the models, there are people definitely developing these. Again, there are different people doing it in different ways, come up with slightly different answers. So there are a lot of people working with different amounts of data that can help us to try and understand these issues of where plastics come from, in what volume, where they get dispersed to, and so on. So yeah, I would say they do exist, but they're also still being developed in a large way.
All right, thank you. Someone is also asking, is it a good idea to do water column sampling in rivers for microplastics?
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting idea, actually, because like we've seen with the ocean, obviously the rivers behave in a completely different way. But interestingly, the study that I did was looking mainly at microplastics in sediments of rivers. So it wasn't necessarily looking at the water column, but I did find that there were quite a lot of polymers that you would expect to be floating. So for example, polyethylene and polypropylene, you would expect them to float in water. So you would expect the river to have just transported them away, but instead they have sunk and they've ended up within the sediment, which again means that really we can't just base our understanding of where plastics will go on the buoyancy of a specific polymer. And so I think if you're wanting to understand what's within the water column, you should either look at the surface and at different levels throughout the water column, or maybe do a kind of composite sample of the different depths just to try and understand the whole water system rather than just what's floating.
All right. Wow, we have many more questions. Ariana is asking, is there any data available to analyze changes in microplastic concentration in the water column over time?
That's an interesting question. And I guess that relates to like a specific site, like monitoring at a specific site. Yeah. So people have done studies over, for example, different seasons and different years, but it's not, people haven't been doing it, as far as I'm aware, it's not been done for a long enough period of time for us to really be able to say, right, within 10 years or 20 years, we've seen this change in the amount of plastic that we're finding in the water. I know in rivers, for example, it's easy to say you can see a seasonal difference. So you might see more or less after heavy rainfall, for example, within the water, spring and summer. Within the ocean, I'm not aware of a study that has done a long-term monitoring to be able to tell us kind of temporal change over time.
All right, thank you. So Sylvain is asking how to test for ecologically relevant effects of microplastic using natural particles with associated biotine compounds and what concentration?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and one that people are talking about a lot in the field of ecotoxicology when it comes to microplastics, in terms of, how do we really understand the real effects? So one of the things that people are recognizing is that we should try and understand the effects of the environmentally relevant concentrations of plastics, because a lot of what people are doing in the laboratory is using very high concentrations. And this is relevant in its own way because it tells us, where do we see effects? How high does the concentration have to be before we see effects on organisms? but it doesn't necessarily help us to understand what effects we might see at the much lower concentrations that we would find within the environment. So that's something that we could do. Also to run experiments for a longer period of time. So rather than days or weeks, do it for months or a year even, and see over the kind of generational time span of an organism, and does it have, generational, multi-generational effects at low concentrations over a long time period. Yes, it would also be really interesting to look at the influence of biofouling and associated chemicals, and this is something that I've been working on a bit, especially with chemicals mainly. The main difficulty is trying to make it complex enough that it represents the environment, but simplistic enough that you can understand what you're seeing. Because if you expose an organism to a plastic with a biofilm and lots of chemicals, and you see an effect, you don't know whether it was due to the plastic, due to the chemicals, you don't know why you've seen that effect. So then you need to, do with and without chemicals, with and without biofilms, different concentrations, and it becomes, enormous. So these are definitely all really interesting questions, but they're kind of things that we have to almost address one thing at a time before we can get more and more complex. And that's kind of the way that the research is going, is that there is more and more research that we can try and use to understand these things. But there's still a lot more that we can do as well.
All right. Yeah, I think the last questions are really good for finishing this presentation. So people are asking basically, what can we do? How can we mitigate? Is it possible to remove them from the ocean? I also have, what do you think is the most important step? What are you working on right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so here you go if you want to, wrap this up. And
Yeah. So I think the most important thing really is to try and stop this at source. It's very easy to say, we've got companies who can remove plastic from the ocean, and to some degree those things might work, but given the amount that we've put in, we're never going to be able to remove everything that is within the environment. And we could probably not even remove it at a rate that we're putting it in. If it's 8 million tons a year, there's not going to be any company that can remove 8 million tons a year of plastic, let alone clear the backlog of what already exists, and all the very small particles that we just wouldn't be able to get rid of. So I think, what's out there, if there are ways of dealing with that, then that's great. But actually, we need to try and stop those things from entering the environment in the first place. And there are lots of ways in which you could argue that that should be done, because people can do their own things, but I think there's obviously industry responsibility. There are regulations that can be put in place, like taxes on plastic bags, banning of microbeads in cosmetics, and so on. So there are measures that can be put into place, and I think it's a whole chain wide responsibility, really. So individuals can do their own thing, but as well, you could put pressure, for example, on your local government to say, can you improve the recycling, or can you put a tax on this so that people use less of it? So that would be what I would say, rather than going out with a sieve and trying to remove all the microplastics, for example. My own research is focusing on a range of things, actually. So it's trying to understand these flows and behaviours of plastics, both within rivers and within the ocean. But really, I come from a biological background, so I'm also really interested in how organisms interact with plastics, and kind of two sides of that. How organisms can change the way that plastics behave. So, if an organism ingests a plastic and then egests it, is the behavior of that particle changed because it's gone through an organism? Or again, we've mentioned biofouling. That's an ecological interaction with a plastic that will change the way that it behaves. And these are really important for us to understand if we want to try and understand how this pollutant acts in general. And then, of course, there's the ecological implications of this. So especially if we're looking in these very kind of pristine environments like the deep sea I've mentioned, Antarctica, Arctic, remote islands are uninhabited. There are places that we know that microplastics are reaching, and the ecosystems there are generally quite vulnerable, haven't maybe been exposed to a lot of pollutants in the past. So how might they react to these pollutants? And can we try and better understand what implications this might have for the wider ecosystems, because we rely a lot on these ecosystems, more than we realize, I think, especially within the ocean. So I think it's about trying to understand the wider implications of plastic pollution as a whole.
All right. Thank you so much. Your presentation was really interesting.